Hello, hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of the Daily Friends Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and I'm joined today by Miss Sara. Sara, how are you doing?
Well, thank you. Well, thank you.
And a special guest today, Dr. Frans Cronje, the CEO of the IRR. Frans, how are you today?
Very well, Nick. Hello to you. Hello to Sara.
So today we're going to be, rather than focusing on what's going on in the news, we're going to be focusing on an important question, and that is the life of the ANC. So, of course, anyone who follows South African politics and media knows that for many people in the media, the ANC forms a sort of center of the universe. It's the most important organization. Everything revolves around it. Opposition parties are criticized for being not enough like the ANC. There's very little imagination about what a future without the ANC might look like. But Frans has recently been suggesting in his commentary on South Africa that the ANC might not be as sturdy a pillar of South African politics as many people perhaps believe, and that we need to start thinking about what the future might be like without an ANC. So, Frans, my question to you to start off is the ANC's life expectancy shorter than perhaps many people think?
Now, look, even the ANC now is being accused of not being enough like the ANC. So no one is enough like the ANC should be. We've been going around saying we think it's kaput. Point of no return is long past. It's going to lose its political control of the country. And we've said this on various platforms. In our more formal guys, where we did lots of formal type consulting, we've been saying it. A lot of queries have come to me from people who've picked up pieces of this, and they say, what are you talking about? Why are you saying it? And the big question is, well, who's going to beat the ANC? So we're trying to address all of that this afternoon. Why do we say it? Well, we're not saying it anew. We first said that the ANC's kaput and would lose in 2040 about the election in 2024. And I recall at the time, it was madness, this. Impossible. The professor of politics at Wits or thereabouts was quoted in a newspaper, had been phoned to say, what do you think of this? And said, these guys are completely nuts. They're clueless, don't know what they're talking about. We stuck with it. Now we're getting a hearing on it. Why do we say it? Don't just make this stuff up. A few hard things behind it. One is the relationship between living standards and jobs, and ANC support is pretty strong. Said that 100 times before, demonstrated in the charts. If you're really interested, do ask us, and I'll be happy. It's an important thing. I'll be happy to send you some of that data. Living standards are tanking now, and that's net negative for ANC support. Just emphasize it, Nick. The number of people with jobs today is 300,000 greater than the number was in 2008, I think. Okay, so forget 300,000 jobs a year. Forget 300,000 jobs a decade. We're nowhere. And if you want to bring the black unemployment rate down to the white rate, you want to do that in a decade, you need to create 1 million jobs per year. So we just off the charts, far away from. So number one. Second thing is the ANC is running out of the electricity it needs to run the country. I hope that we might be able to get Eskom's boss on with you at some point. They've reached out to us to talk about some of our commentary. Very happy to talk to them. And based on how that goes, I'm going to propose to them that they come and talk to you and explain the position. They think
That
we're
would
too
be
quick.
fun.
But I think from an energy perspective, if you look at the availability factor, things are not turning around, despite the war rooms and plans and recaps and whatever it is. The third thing that's happening is the government's running out of money. If you want to run a country, you need a certain amount of money to implement your policies, and the debt position, the deficit position is just insane. The budget deficit is rivaling levels the country has seen 3 times in its history. In the aftermath of the Rubicon speech, as apartheid was collapsing after 50 years, the Second World War and the First World War, and we're back there again. So you've run out of money, and all those occasions precipitated political realignments. Running out of money precipitated 94, 48 precipitated the defeat of Smuts. I mean, the 48 was the defeat of Smuts on the back of this deficit. Countries run out of money, the governments tend to change. So there are three reasons. The fourth reason is that the ANC is running out of votes, because we count these things and we do polling, and Sarah Palin famously said, polls are for strippers and skiing, but they have great utility. Be cautious, yeah, but they have greater utility. And we polled the ANC a couple of weeks ago, and on the raw numbers, it's not an election forecast, but you've got to factor in voter turnout and things, or what kind of election, 49%. That's the ANC. Amongst younger, better educated, urban people, higher income people, it's very far off 50%. Deep, deep, deep down. We now know that there are more people who do not vote than the number of people who vote for the ANC. That gap has been widening to a point where now if half of people who don't vote choose to vote for something else, the ANC would lose outright. So that's the background. That's why we're saying it's not because, a lot of analysts talk such a lot of nonsense. I mean, they basically read the Sunday newspapers and sell what they read to their clients. We've always had it, and we're serious about it, because giving this kind of advice is it's not an amateur's game. And if you're going to do it, people might listen to what you say and they might base decisions on that. So you've got to be damn sure that you can back it up. And we take great pride through the broader IRR group of organizations actually doing the hard legwork. And where all the big trends, the macro trends point now, is to the possibility that it's asking what will the ANC do with South Africa is not the only question. That's always been the question. It's been the question for 40 years. What the question is becoming is what might be done with South Africa if the ANC is not there to do it.
Sarah, anything to add? Do you agree with Frans's overall view?
I do. I just want to perhaps add an irony. Cyril Ramaphosa has said that the ANC, like much of the ANC first, the country second. He will save the ANC. He will support the ANC, come what may, at the expense of the country. And it just might be possible that the dedicated servant of the ANC may be the president that actually splits the ANC, because he's done so little and he's shown so little power that it's to my mind, it's kind of emboldened the RET faction, the sort of the Zuma, the Ace, the Jesse, Duarte, etc. And they are now, between meeting Julius Malema for tea and attacking the Zondo Commission for basically unearthing how absolutely terrible the ANC is, they're going on the attack. That theoretically should, I don't see how Cyril Ramaphosa is going to hold those people if the pressures become great enough. So I don't know, before they fall out of power, they might actually fall out with each other.
So if the RET faction is indeed on the rise, or perhaps even if it isn't, I guess there's a fear that if the ANC loses at the ballot box, it'll simply do what countries like Zimbabwe and Venezuela have done and hold on to power through force. Frans, how likely do you think that is?
Yeah, okay, let's get into the... so far, what I've said, you'd think, these trends are definitive, it's the end of them. Let's complicate things somewhat. Let's start with the idea of the factions. There's an RET faction, and they sort of held up in the media as being bad, and they're fighting the Ramaphosa faction, which is held up as being good. And of late, the RET faction have come together in this triumvirate around Jacob Zuma, the reason for which is that triumvirate is afraid that they will go to jail, and they want to prevent that. And this shows that the Ramaphosa faction is now winning, and this is very good, because if it survives, we'll talk about whether it will survive, it will then introduce reforms. Doesn't work. There is a RET faction that is exceptionally dangerous and has caused terrible damage to the country. That triumvirate sums it up pretty nicely. And if they were to gain more power and influence than they've had, remember, they've really run the country for the last decade. So it's not as if they will gain. Whether they will remain is really the question. They would lead us in, things would get exceptionally bad. But on the other side, is there a good faction that's fighting them? And it's not that clear at all. Many of the individuals around the Ramaphosa camp are themselves ensnared in allegations of malfeasance and corruption that would cause them to worry a bit too, that maybe this triumvirate has a point, and this Zondo business is getting a little bit out of hand. If you hear what's being said and you start arresting people, it's terribly serious. So it's not a clear-cut good and bad. Both factions ultimately will have an interest in preventing widespread mass prosecutions of state capture suspects and those implicated around them. And that goes even beyond the ANC. The ANC didn't conjure up the money that was stolen over the past decade. That money came in one form or another out of South Africa's private sector. It wasn't carried around in bags of cash alone. It was far too much of it. And a lot of it went through the banking system. And there are banking executives who must have been aware and who would find themselves. So the idea that there's a bad faction and it's made up of these three chaps who are trying to have tea together and the rest are good, it doesn't hold together that. And in the final analysis, very few of the dominant economic and political actors of the past decade that had anything to do with business in the state or making policy for the state will be worried about where prosecutions might ultimately lead. That's part one of complicating the factions. The second complication is, let's say this triumvirate is defeated, they lose, they go to jail or something, and Cyril Ramaphosa wins, whatever that means. Reform follows. That's the cliche. That's what we hear from business clients. That's what we hear in the media. I don't think that's the case, because the appetite for the kinds of reform South Africa needs does not exist even within the Ramaphosa camp, if there is such a thing, of the ANC itself. That camp leans towards statist interventions, believes there are holy cows in labor, in empowerment, on EWC that cannot be reversed or redressed. And South Africa's economic malaise, perhaps best highlighted now in its employment rate. It's also called the labor market absorption rate. It measures what proportion of people of working age have a job. That's at the moment about 38%. What does that mean? Good, bad? Well, emerging markets tend to average around 70%. And we're at half the average, and developed economies as well. I mean, it is, again, it's like the budget deficit. It's off the charts and to bring that back, to create the requisite jobs, will require such wholesale reforms as to be on a scale of what happened here in the 1980s and the 1990s. So even if the Ramaphosa camp of Mr. Ramaphosa wins this current set too with the state capture chaps, that for us does not necessarily lead to it does. I'll be quite emphatic. I don't think that leads to structural reform for South Africa at all.
I mean, I completely agree with that, because of course we've seen in some ways more moves to undermine property rights and the free market under Ramaphosa than we ever did under Zuma. The expropriation bill is just one example of that. Sara, anything to add on Ramaphosa and the ANC factions? Sara, you're muted.
I was just keeping the helicopter away. I think the thing to bear in mind about exactly that about Ramaphosa is he always was a socialist, and I mean a socialist. I mean, as you correctly say, there's been so much legislation that points to statist interventions when we should be going in completely the opposite direction to save this economy. But it seems that now finally the scales are falling from people's eyes about Cyril, that he was never really a businessman. He has no business instincts. He was not a friend of the business community. Probably the last community to realize that may have been the business community itself. But it is entirely, and he's got his allies, so to speak, are either strongly ideological that way, or he's got a whole lot of youngish ministers and oldish ministers who are just purely incompetent. So one can't expect much from them anyway, whatever their ideological leanings are. But the only thing that will probably hold them together is that the existence of the ANC is the existence of employment for them. And without it, there is nothing. So they need to cleave to something.
Right. Sorry, I just also want to clarify something. When we say RET, faction of the ANC, we mean Radical Economic Transformation faction. So that's sort of more socialist than the socialists kind of approach.
I think it actually means more, whatever keeps them alive. Yeah.
Right.
Cyril Ramaphosa, let me say something nice about him. That I think that had he inherited a country that was growing quite quickly, such as that at the end of the Mbeki era, in which institutions were pretty sound, private sector largely dominant and influential, life getting better, ANC support on the upward track, these phenomenally corrupt and dangerous political actors not around, absent. I think he would have run South Africa pretty well. And he's screwed up a hell of a lot, and undoubtedly so. And we know. But what he inherited, I mean, he's done terribly badly. Terribly. I mean, he's taken a bad hand and he's made it a lot worse. Continues to bungle. Like this idea that the state can centralize vaccinations. I mean, they're busy sending back vaccines that they welcomed last week while I mean, it's more chaotic than
they're on the tarmac.
Brussels. The Europeans aren't even this inept at centralizing their vaccine procurement. What he inherited, I said earlier, Nick, the point of no return was behind us. It predates 2008. By the time he came in, and you can't say he came in, he'd been number 2 through the years of
right.
Exactly.
By the time he came in, I think the evidence will later showed was already unsalvageable. The Eskom problem was already there. The deficit was already beginning to blow out. The policy trajectory had turned very sharply after 2008. With EWC being the litmus test. And the ANC had lost its best people. It had lost the thinkers, it had lost the intellects, it had lost look at the caliber of parliament. And you go back, you should actually do this. Go find a YouTube clip of parliament between 94 and 98. And it's not great, but you'll be shocked at the comparison to today. There was at least discussion, debate about policy, not howling and throwing objects at your peers and fist fights and shouting and swearing. And it's as nuts as the deficit, as the unemployment rate. These things are crazy, Nick. And we take them as kind of the status quo because we suffer from a sort of Stockholm syndrome. And we've been so ground down that we think, well, maybe this is okay. A parliament that behaves like our one is entirely incapable of staging any kind of economic recovery. It's not going to happen. So on Cyril, I think had he inherited a thing that was working pretty well, I think it would have turned out to be okay. But many politicians aren't wonderful people. And timing and luck and all of that's in it. But he inherited a position that I think very few people could have turned around at all, though he's compounded the mess that he was handed. Nick?
Very interesting idea. I know on your point about the crazy parliament, I know the DA likes to put its sort of more solid and physically imposing members on the outside of its benches to absorb potential incoming violence.
From the fist fights. My goodness.
So we're in a strange place. Okay, but speaking of Parliament, there's some other scenarios about how people suggest the ANC might sort of cling on. The one is that the ANC, if they fall below 50%, they'll go into coalition. Let's assume that they can't do it with the small sort of rats and mice party like the ATM or whatever, and they have to go into coalition with one of the two big parties. So let's start off with the EFF and then talk about a possible coalition with the DA, which is something that some people whispered under their breaths.
Well, what the client immediately goes to says, well, they're going to lose, and when they come back, they'll be back with the EFF. And in fact, it's very interesting, Nick. You know that the broader ANC, to include the EFF and the ANC together, is today in a stronger position relative to the broader opposition, that means all the opposition parties together, than was the case in 1994. That's how much and how little has changed at once. Where on the EFF thing, it seems at a superficial level to make sense. But play it out in practice. Mr. Ramaphosa is now gone. He's lost. The election's been a disaster. 49%. He won't survive that. He's now replaced by someone who you don't know, Mr. Mabuza, Paul Mashatile, anyone. That chap, newly in the job, he now controls the ANC. He's very, very powerful. All this patronage at his fingertips, literally. What's your first thing that you're going to do? Are you going to invite into your tent the most formidable and hardworking and ruthless political actor South Africa's seen in decades, and say, please come and join me? Because whoever you are that takes over the ANC, you know that Julius Malema is going to eat you for breakfast. You have no chance. So if you're at around 49, 48%, and you only need a little bit, you'll go to one of the rats and mice parties, perhaps. You'll say to its leader, you know, do you want to become a cabinet minister? You can be like Patricia de Lille. And you'll get a cavalcade of cars, and it'll be wonderful. Very big pension at the end of the day. So the default, the ANC will go to the EFF, doesn't automatically follow. The great hope was, for a long time, there's a hope in the DA as well, is that the better ANC and the better DA, sort of them Becky-eyed ANC, and again, I'll be nice. I don't know what our listeners think of this, but, there was an era when the ANC ran South Africa with a budget surplus. Now, that is arch fiscal conservatism. The economy grew quite quickly. The number of people with jobs doubled. It wasn't all from the get-go a complete mess. I don't think that DA thing works either, because the better thinkers in the ANC are gone. They've departed. In the past week, 2 presidential advisors have written independently in the media. One to say the problem in the economy is negative sentiment, driven by people for reasons ranging from prejudice to driving of conspiracy theories. I mean, if you genuinely believe, now this comes out of the Union Building, that the reason your economy is not growing while the rest of the world recovers from COVID, is because of negative stereotypes and narratives, and you genuinely believe that, then we're in a hopeless position. Because, I mean, EWC is not a stereo, it's your policy. You advertise. Second piece written by a second presidential advisor said that, essentially, I summarize, that the pursuit of economic growth should not be a primary policy priority for South Africa, because the country was too poor and unequal to allow growth, because there were too many poor people, and we should rather first redistribute assets to give poor people more to spend, including if that's through great state-financed employment programs, so that internal consumption can drive growth.
Yes, the evidence that works is very, very, very thin.
I mean, there is no evidence that it works. Not even the ANC's own history shows that it works. The ANC was at its political pinnacle, the strongest it has ever been, in 2004. 69%. 6 points stronger than when Mandela led South Africa to freedom, coinciding with an era when the economy grew at 5% for 4 consecutive years, which is the first time it had maintained that level of growth for that number of years since 1970. And Ramaphosa's office today writes in the newspaper, we don't think growth should be the priority. I mean, it's not just out of global experience, it's completely at odds with the party's own experience, and it shows the depth of the depth to which the intellect in the ANC is diminished. If you want to add to my electricity running out of money, electricity supporters intellect, you can add that. And as a consequence, the scope for finding common ground with the DA, it's better people, also a party that's at a hard time, is very limited. So it's not EFF ANC necessarily, it's not DA ANC necessarily. More likely initially going to be ANC 48, 49, with some of the rats and mice parties sort of holding it up. On the thought, the EFF would also be cautious about joining the ANC because of the risk of catching the falling knife. The ANC below 50 means plummeting. And if you bolt your future to a plummeting political movement, it takes you with it, and we get 2 birds with 1 stone effect. Right, Nick.
Sara, very quickly, because we're sort of coming towards the end here, anything to add to that before we move on to our last sort of section here?
No, I think that essentially, we're sort of moribund by the inability to do anything that is positive. It's almost as if the ratings agencies, the IMF, the World Bank, or whatever it is, this is what is required for your economy to grow, for uptake in employment, blah blah blah, etc., etc., etc. And it's almost like doubling down. The ANC is going in, as you say, a completely unworkable, unprovable scenario. And I think it's partly a reflection of the fact that the only way to have tackled coming into power when Ramaphosa did was to really grab the ANC by the neck. He had nothing else to lose, except he couldn't have done it because that's not what he believes, and this is where we've ended up. I think his advisors are going to, if they haven't been completely discredited already, will be further discredited, because it's, I mean, even their best buddy, their sort of light on the mountain or the hill or whatever it is, Cuba, is freeing up its economy. I won't say it's becoming a sort of, a free market democracy, but it has decided to free up its economy because, together with COVID, it has sunk so badly economically that it recognizes that the status model, the command economy model, on its own is just not going to bring them back out. So they have to move towards a more free market idea.
Right. I mean, it's a strange day when the ANC looks like it's going to be more left wing than the Cuban government.
Yeah, that's how bizarre things are.
So here's the very important question then, and let me put these 2 questions together. If the ANC is doomed, what comes next? Is there a new party? If so, where does that party's leadership come from? Or will it be something like the EFF or the DA?
Okay, we've done badly here, Nick, because I was asked by a friend to get onto one of your shows to answer this question, and we've got 30 seconds. So I suggest with your...
We can go a few minutes over.
But I will answer the question quickly because I promised I would. ANC sinks, below 50, few years of shambolic coalition, and thereafter the climate will be right for a brand new political movement on the centre-right to come to power or be the dominant influence in the 2029 coalition, and it will introduce the reforms that will see South Africa boom through the 2030s. So there, you know who you are. There's the answer. And if Nick invites me back again, we can have a show about the detail around that and how we get there. Nick, it's awesome talking to you. Sara, too. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks very much, Frans. Thanks very much, Sara. And if you enjoyed this show, please share the video. Please share the podcast. We love to have your support. Please leave us reviews and leave us likes on YouTube if you're watching there. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you found this interesting. And we shall be back to address the question of the life after the ANC, I'm sure, soon. Anyway, we will see you tomorrow on the next episode of the Daily Friend Show. Have a great day, everyone.